Let's get centered. This week, special guest Chuck Todd joins us to discuss the new digital media landscape and how things are looking in the horse race for control of Congress as the 2026 midterms inch slightly closer. Plus, will the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska look just like 2018 in Helsinki? And what's really behind Trump's DC takeover? I'm Louis Miranda alongside Jeremy Murphy and Carl Meacham. Gents, I almost feel like we should be playing the theme music to Meet the Press today. I'm looking forward to hearing from Chuck.
I grew up watching Meet the Press with Tim Russert, with my dad, and it was just...
I was going to say, not with Chuck Todd.
Yeah, but, when Russert died, it really suffered, and I think Chuck really brought back some gravitas and, the nuts and bolts of Washington and how it worked. He just had a real love of that, and it really came across on screen.
I think, bringing someone who was an expert, not from the television world, but from the horse race coverage world, I think was really smart.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think he was victim of the broader problems happening with media. It'll be interesting to hear what he has to say about, how that whole thing developed. He's still very relevant. I mean, he's got his new media. What is it? His new platform, Newsphere, is it?
Yeah. Well, it's not his platform, but he's just launched a Sunday show on it.
Yeah.
A Sunday evening show.
He's one of those names. It's instant credibility because he is just known in Washington as being a straight shooter. And so when you hear him associated with anything, like, my ears go up because he is, he's the guy. I mean, he really turned Meet the Press around, and like I said, instant credibility.
Yeah. And certainly he's also been the focus of a lot of criticisms from the current occupant of the White House. So it'll be fun to hear how he feels that Donald Trump suddenly likes him.
But he
he
actually said that Donald Trump was the most consequential president since FDR.
He did, though I'm not sure he meant it in a positive light. I think you could read it in many different ways.
Sure.
And I think his point was that he's affected so many different aspects. He's trying to get involved with the Commanders, deal with the stadium. He's trying to set the stage culturally, taking over the Kennedy Center.
Right.
We're
clearly aware of those things, Luis, but I think that it's very interesting because when people talk about Donald Trump, you never hear a sort of middle of the road sort of assessment. You like him or you hate him.
Yeah.
And I think these statements, that is the truth. I would say that. I mean, you don't have to like the things that he's doing to say that he's having impact.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's the bad way.
All right. So Chuck will join us in just a few minutes. But in the meantime, I'm in the nation's capital where there's a federal takeover underway. The Trump administration announced this week a takeover of the Metropolitan Police Department by federal authorities and a deployment of federal agents and National Guard to the nation's capital to tackle what he considers a crime wave. Of course, the city's official statistics show that there's been a significant decline in major crime. Things like murder are down, although there's also been some question about whether some of those numbers have been a little bit cooked from the police union in particular, which is supportive of the takeover. And oddly, a lot of the focus over the last 24 hours has been about Democrats being divided over this. That, some Democrats want to highlight the federal takeover for what it looks like, which is an authoritarian style takeover, whereas others are happy to see something being done about crime. And I think that anyone who's debating this and thinking about it strictly in the context of DC crime is missing the bigger picture. Because it's true that there's some crime that needs to be dealt with and that has been out of control during the pandemic and since, even if it's gotten better. There's carjackings. You can't walk into a CVS now and grab something off the shelves. You've got to call someone over to unlock a break-proof glass because there's been so many mobs that run in and steal a lot of stuff off the shelves. And so they started putting stuff behind. There's one 7-Eleven where the ice cream is behind a padlocked plexiglass. And yet the people who are most concerned about crime are minority communities where a lot of the more violent crimes typically happen. There's certainly a lot of gun violence that occurs in the city, but this is where the hypocrisy and if Democrats focus on the divide, where they're missing the point. Republicans have been the ones that have stood in the way of common sense gun safety. They're also the ones who in Congress and the White House froze over $1 billion of DC's funding in March. And, Donald Trump pardoned 1,600 criminals who rampaged through the city and attacked the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. So if you're focused on just the actual issue of crime in DC, you're missing the bigger picture, because to me, this is an attempt to normalize what we're seeing in DC. Just, not far from where I am, there was a checkpoint yesterday, just stopping regular people. I mean, that's not something that we're accustomed to seeing. Maybe on a weekend night when they're trying to stop drunk drivers, you're used to that. But on a weekday, just a weekday afternoon, to have federal officers stopping and interrogating people who are just driving on a normal city street, I think that's sort of the difference that I think is hard to accept. That this is not about crime. This is about normalizing something that could potentially be much, much more egregious.
I think it's the average viewer is going, the average news reader or whatnot is going to look at it as a strong man is coming in and cleaning it up. People are very basic, and everybody's passed the baton on this one. But Trump, we know he's wrong, but I think what they're seeing is someone sticking their neck out saying, I'm going to do something about this. And I think the average person, that's what appeals to them. I mean, I lived in New York City, and the city was unmanageable until Rudy Giuliani, and he was a tyrant. He violated everybody's human rights, and I mean, and he cleaned up the city. So I think the average person is looking at this and rooting him on.
This city has experienced better crime rates, right? Homicides are down, carjackings are down. But, in contrast to other cities, Memphis, New Orleans, St. Louis, Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, they have much higher numbers than DC. So I think the question that this really does highlight is, if they're doing this in DC, why can't they do it in these other cities? And then the question there is the use of federalizing policing, what the implications of that mean for different parts of the country, and just broadly for the United States. The militarization of the police is something that I think should have us all concerned. And I do think that there is another context here as well, Luis and Jeremy, that you guys understand, which is DC is 45% Black. It's run Muriel Bowser, a Black mayor, Pamela Smith, Black chief of police, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Black representative in Congress. This cannot be sort of delinked from that context. And I think a lot of DC folks, and when we're talking about DC, we're not talking about Northwest. We're not talking about areas that are predominantly white and that have folks that work in Congress or people that are in the lobbying world or lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. We're talking about the bulk of the city in places like Southeast and Northeast, right? Where a lot of this policing is taking place, and they're not looking at it through the eyes of, oh, they're going to come and help, do away with crime. They're looking at it in a racialized context. And that's something.
And we're already seeing examples of people being tied to the ICE operation where,
Yep.
They get picked up for not having a permit, and next thing you know, they're being turned over to ICE as they leave with just a basic citation. So,
Right.
Guys, happy to announce here that our guest has arrived.
Yep.
Let me add him to the stage here. Chuck, welcome to Centered.
Hi, guys.
It's good to have you on. It's a real honor. Let me introduce you to the guys. Of course, you and I go way
Apologies
back.
here with my mic. I had it off, put it out of the way, not to accidentally get caught on a hot mic. So here I am.
Always something to be careful with in Washington. But yeah, Carl Meacham, he is a veteran of the Senate. He spent a dozen years with Dick Lugar in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but also a Clinton appointee before that. And then Jeremy Murphy, he spent over a decade over at CBS in headquarters in New York, running interference for Les Moonves, blacking, doing all that good stuff. And yeah, I know we really appreciate you having you on, because you have been such a perfect example of how media has evolved, being there when the internet started to create new spaces, rising through the hotline, and then taking over the longest running television show in history, and now making a space in the digital media ecosystem that's evolving. So really excited to have you on to hear your perspective about that evolution.
Appreciate it. No, it's I'm done whining about, look, the information ecosystem is a mess, right? But it's not the first time it's been a mess. The history of media is a series of a new technology comes along, it creates fragmentation, leads to consolidation. Then there's a new technology, and the cycle repeats, and we're in a period of fragmentation. Which I said, I benefited from it in my 20s. It's a lot easier to benefit from disruption in your 20s than it is in your 50s. But I'm weirdly optimistic, even as messy as all this looks now, because there is a lot of spaghetti being thrown at the wall, and that's usually, eventually something's going to stick.
Chuck, I have a question. First of all, I'm a big fan. I grew up watching Meet the Press
Thank you
with
for saying that.
Tim Russert. And when you brought in, I thought you brought in a real gravitas and the nuts and bolts, and you totally made it your own. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So my question is, Meet the Press was always a place where, both sides can come on and talk intelligently, and you would give them the space. And it was great. It was appointment viewing. And then one side started lying and manipulating and distorting. So when you're booking guests, if you know they're going to do that, do you say, okay, I'll have them on, but we're going to just confront them? Or do you just say, you know what, you're a liar, we don't want you on? Like, where's the line there?
So I always, I always said I never had bans, right? There was this movement right after January 6th where there was a lot of virtue signaling, and you had other people in my space saying, we will never put on somebody that didn't certify the election. And I'm like, okay, so you're not gonna put the Speaker of the House on? At the end of the day, the voters made these folks relevant before I did. Now, I looked at it this way: what's in the best interest of the viewer? I always say this: I made a compact with the viewers. I'm trying to deliver them information. Who's going to provide them info? And so I think you look at it on a case by case basis, right? If you know somebody is intentionally going to use the situation for fundraising, just to throw a temper, then you don't put them on. But if at the end of the day, they're chairman of their House oversight, they're going to have subpoena power, and you're trying to understand, why are you doing this? Try to figure it out. My job is to conduct an interview that at least helps the viewers understand why so-and-so is doing this. I mean, ultimately, I always viewed it as I'm in the education space. What am I educating the viewers on today? I'm educating them about an issue, educating them about a political situation, they tuned in because they're trying to get a deeper understanding on what's happening, right? So I think that this it made it a challenge. The conclusion I've come to, and I look back at the different ways that we all managed this, I think the biggest mistake has been shortening interviews. And I think that so right now, like you sort of, and I get it, right? You want to, hey, look at all these people we have on our guest list. But it's like baseball analytics. Everybody's figured out, everybody's dealing with the same data. Everybody 5-minute interview, you can, the interviewer has like a series of questions they want to get to. So they're only going to have so many amount of attempts at follow-ups. The guest knows this. They kind of play the game. They can run out the clock. They can do these things. where, I mean, this is why I love this space where, I'll go 30 minutes, I'll go 40 minutes. It's less confrontational, but I think it's more illuminating. And I think that, it's hard to maintain a lie beyond 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't care who you are. And so I think the best antidote to this current situation is longer interviews. And the thing is, then it becomes self-selecting. Those that can't handle something like that aren't going to want to be on your show.
Which often is right now. It seems like Democrats have had the biggest trouble with that. That they're afraid of the longer formats and of having to answer tough questions. I think, as far as I'm seeing in the evolution of it, you've got Pete Buttigieg, who seems like he's willing to go on for
Right.
a couple hours on a podcast, but a lot of Democrats don't have the comfort of that because they're so worried about offending someone.
Kamala Harris, right? Like she
Yeah.
wouldn't do these long interviews. And, I actually had a fairly lengthy interview with her in spring of 22. I want to say, I think it was spring of 22, it was in Houston. We did it at NASA. And I remember thinking that the conversation off the record was a heck of a lot more interesting than the conversation on the record. She was so, she was thinking about every phrase. She was thinking like a lawyer, right? She was being very careful. I understood why, but the more voters don't want to see you come across calculating. And I think that's what that comes across as. She's trying to be non-offensive, and I understand it, but this is the problem, right? That the Democrats have been taken over by interest groups, right? Unfortunately for them, the Democratic coalition is so interest group specific. I mean, where it feels like you've got Chris Matthews used to call it the xylophone. You got to play every note correctly. Okay, this is the Teamsters note, and this is the Emily's List note, and this is the LCV note, and it sort of, I think it took away authenticity and personality to many of these folks.
Well, it took away that. I think you're exactly right. I mean, the Democratic Party is a bunch of different interest groups, right?
Mhm.
And you wonder sometimes what holds them all together. But the question that I have for you, Chuck, is the role of media in this environment, I think, is under strain. And your ability to, really dig into the truth is challenged. And some of the things that we talk about here are, what are the consequences of doing your job? And you could find yourself doing what you're doing and you do it so well, and then be in a situation where they want to take you off the air. I mean,
Right.
one of the things that we talk about with folks that have experienced more authoritarian environments, right, is that they will just arrest journalists. Give me your take on that. There's a lot. I'd love to just get your reaction on the challenges of doing your job in this kind of environment.
Well, right now I don't have the challenge, right? I'm independent. And in that sense, that is liberating, right? In that I don't have to worry about, and this used to happen all the time. There were a variety of issues I would run into at the big network, right? One could be another personality was also trying to book somebody. It could be that a network executive wanted to preserve an interview for a person or for a timing or for a special, right? So you'd run into that. You have the access issue, right? If you're too tough on them, all of a sudden you get cut off, right? And the reporting teams get cut off, right? So that's the real challenges that the traditional networks are running in. And I think this is why you've seen what appears to be collective retreat, right? And I can tell you none of the individual journalists like retreating, but it's a feeling of collective retreat. As I always say, everybody has a boss, and you've got to deal with it. I will say this: the capitulation in Trump 2.0 from the non-political entities, all right? You expect capitulation from a politician, okay? Political party pressure, that is what it is. But to watch CEOs decide to just pay to play, to watch academic leaders pay to play, to watch law firms pay to play, to watch, essentially corporate owners of media organizations pay to play, that is the real damage that's been done. And, this is the frustration I have. All of them are, I look at a Tim Cook, and he's got his own challenges, right? He's got to run Apple's business. And Donald Trump has the power to really mess up Apple's business. right? With tariffs, with all sorts of stuff. So with him, you could imagine the meeting, right? Well, all right, you gotta, let him announce this, right? Go ahead and let's give him a gold-plated, iPhone or something, whatever it is. It's no sweat off our back if it means he's not going to punish our, right? But it is your Apple. You're essentially the most. You're certainly you're the 21st century symbol of American corporations.
Yeah.
Okay, right? You're the right. If GM was the symbol of the 20th century, right, and GE arguably, right, in the 21st century so far, it's arguably Apple and Amazon.
Yeah.
And so when those two guys, right, they're two of the 3 or 4 most valuable companies. When they go ahead and capitulate, well, that sends a message to everybody that's smaller than them, right? And so what I don't think they appreciate is that they end up setting the example. So when the White House deals with another company that may want to push back, they say, well, Tim Cook didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who do you think you are?
Yeah.
And that's what's happened here, right? When you think about in Trump 1.0, there was a collective bipartisan, it was across the board. Civil society resisted the most extreme things.
Yep.
The courts were more focused on the Constitution. Corporate America was more skeptical and provided distance. Everybody did, and the Democrats behaved more as protectors of the Constitution than as partisans. And now nobody is standing up using the tools of the Constitution. And only the Democrats are, and they're not, and they're debating whether to stick by constitutional principles or accept the premise that there are no rules anymore and this is a knife fight. And I think that without other parts of society stepping up, it has made it easier for Democrats to fall into this trap, and I think it's a trap, of accepting the premise of Donald Trump's theory of the case, which is everybody's corrupt. It's just all about who's winning and who's losing.
But Chuck, isn't the alternative to just give up and let Republicans, steal these 5 seats in Texas and then essentially not be able to have any of the checks and balances that we should be having?
So I have this crazy idea that Democrats ought to run a campaign in Texas and make it part of a governor's race and make it part of the campaign. I know that sounds insane. Take it to the people. Go run a campaign. Look, it's hard. Nobody said this was easy. The easy thing to do is to go redraw your districts in California. Yeah. The hard thing to do is to sit on your hands as a political party for the last decade and do crap in the state of Texas and the state of Florida, and then whine when you're suddenly both states have been begging for competition. Arguably, you have I've always said that you have 2 really pathetic state parties down there for the Democrats, because there's 45% of voters would like to support a Democratic Party. The party doesn't do anything. They don't do voter registration campaigns. These are states that are, the voters make more competitive than the party apparatus. When the first instinct is, well, forget it, we just have to leave Texas and try this. Run a campaign.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I do think that, and there are some Democrats that are organizing now on the Texas side to say, like, hey, they're actually lowering the margins on these districts to a point where, maybe we can actually surprise them, and this ends up backfiring, if not in the 5 seats that they're trying to claim, and some of the others that they've now made, if not competitive, at least closer than they would have been.
At least the best argument I've heard, if against the Republicans on this, is if they think the voters are with them, why are they bothering with the remap?
The other thing that I think,
go run a campaign.
That's right.
The other thing that I think is really funny is that redistricting has always been a problem. I think that, and both sides have been guilty of it. A lot of people point to Illinois. I think you were saying on the Chuck Todd cast that of all places to go, Illinois is probably the worst one, because of
I know he's paying the bill, and I get it. I write Pritzker's paying the bills, right? You probably get Hyatt points or something. But there was 48 other states they could have picked. I probably wouldn't have gone to Maryland either. Right? Those 2 states were probably the 2 most gerrymandered. But it was sort of like, don't hand your opponents an easy optical hit. That's all.
Yeah, and as having been in the Democratic Party, for the last 25 years, looking at also the focus on demographics and the these buckets of people that I'm Hispanic, so automatically the assumption is that I can only talk to Hispanics, or that the typical Democratic leadership will look at me and assume that I don't speak English. Hablo un poquito de English.
Yeah, I grew up in
And
Miami, and my mother knew more Spanish than most third generation Cubans. Okay, that's just was a fact.
yeah, and so you look at the way that the party has shifted, and I think coming out of the civil rights movement, one of my criticisms and one of the things that I tried to do, for example, when I was running communications at the DNC, was to break up what was these minority media positions. I didn't want to tell the African American on my team that he could only talk to Black media and have like an African American media director. I
Right.
wanted him to be in charge of the whole South, as just one of the regional media directors, and that meant that they had to answer the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the African American newspaper there as well. And the same thing with Florida, that they would have to take the call from NBC6 as
Mhm.
much as from El Nuevo Herald. And
Right.
that, I think, is the way that I usually talk about it, is that 60 years after Selma, we should stop asking for separate lunch counters at this point, and start to reduce that, because I do think that the party has focused a little bit too much on those buckets. And when I look
Yeah.
at the redistricting battle, one of these interesting things that I see is that it might actually be a good thing to distribute some of these groups into
Yes.
different districts and potentially give them more power than they've had. And don't get me wrong, I think that what has happened before was necessary to get us to a point of civic participation and engagement and
Mhm.
representation. I think we are at the point where it's worth exploring these as a way to fix some of these issues. And it's not going to work with square districts in every state because
Yeah.
of the way that the populations are distributed, but
Right.
it might actually fix the problem in the long term.
Oh, I
What?
remember one of my favorite examples of the power of so the 1991 reapportionment was a
Mhm.
fascinating debate, and I don't mean to, but it goes to this topic you're bringing up, Luis. And Georgia's perhaps the best example of this. Georgia in 1990, I believe, they had 11 seats, I think, at the time, and it was 8-3 to Dems, D to R. The Bush Justice Department decided to really push hard for majority minority districts, and the Congressional Black Caucus was like, right on. Well, the Democratic Party was like, ooh, are you sure you want to do that? Right. So the Bush Justice Department went all over the country, helping make sure there were majority minority districts all over the South. And within 2 years, Republicans had controlled the House after a 40-year slip, because they created 3 African American districts in Georgia and 8 Republican districts. Right. It literally went one place. So that gets to your point there. But I actually have one of my favorite phrases to abuse lately with my friend Jake Tapper has been this original sin, right? The book, the
Mhm.
title of his book, meaning where's the original sin? And to me, there's multiple original sins here, and it has, and none of them took place in 23 or 24, in my opinion.
Mhm.
I think one of the original sins on the Democratic side was right after the 2012 reelect, Luis, and it was the assumption that, this wasn't just Democrats, the entire establishment, right? Political community, I throw myself into this. Republicans believe this. The assumption was, whoa, this identity politics is where it's at. This is why Obama won. Turns out that is not why Obama won. Obama won on class issues, not on identity. Right? Obama won because it got a lot of working class whites in Iowa and in Michigan looked at Mitt Romney and said, is that guy one of us? Right? And the ad campaigns that the Obama campaign ran in the Big 10 states, and I call them the Big 10 states because it was the Big 10 television network that they saturated. They were just ads about outsourcing to China, Bain Capital, right? It was a class campaign. Well, why has Donald Trump succeeded? Because he ran a campaign on class divides, right? And I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans used to attack, Carl, you'll remember this because you were on the R side, would attack Democrats for class warfare. Why? Because class warfare worked.
Yep.
Ask Bob Schrum. Ask ask Stan Greenberg, who was begging the party to think more as class, because working class Latinos, working class blacks, and working class whites all had the same concerns.
Yep.
And if you're messaging on class and you're thinking of the electorate in division, look, you're going to think of the electorate in buckets no matter what. But if not all Latinos think alike, not all whites think alike, not all blacks think alike. But when you start to divide by race and income, right, you realize more people align by their way of life actually than necessarily by their identity. And I think the Democrats got captured by an incorrect diagnosis of their victory in 2012. Shoot, like I said, even the Republicans believed it, or because they wouldn't have done the autopsy that they did in 2013. And it turned out we were all wrong. Donald Trump, I used to joke, boy, if he ever drops the racism, he's going to create a multi-ethnic working class coalition. Well, he didn't fully drop the racism, and he created a multi-ethnic working class coalition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Or people didn't care. Or people didn't care because they want to have, cheaper groceries. They want to have,
We're all transactional.
better
By the way,
job. Exactly.
we've always been transactional. I
Yep.
think we can't be naive to think that, look, I always say this, I have the luxury to vote on character in the democracy.
Yeah. One thing here that I want to get to, because I think you really put your finger on it. It's culture. It's culture class. That's, I think, synonymous or can be synonymous sometimes.
Certainly the Venn diagrams are yes.
For sure.
Think of wrestling. Like wrestling in some ways is a culture that really is it's the viewership excitement is really a class thing.
Yeah, and it leads me to this question. I remember campaigning in Laconia, New Hampshire, and giving all my, paraphernalia out. And a woman, after I did that, she was very polite. She listened to me, and then she said, "And another thing, don't forget that white people are poor too." This is something that I think has gone totally over the heads of the Democrats when it comes to a lot of these issues that they're concerned about. And this separation that we were talking about early on, the blacks and the whites and the labor and this, and it's all so separated. What Trump was able to do was to give one message to a broader group of folks. And we can criticize what the message was. Bottom line, it resonated. And this is the situation that we have. We have a situation where people are more, I guess, accepting of the use of a more executive function to get things done than waiting for Congress to do its job. But it goes to the statements and the things that you've talked about on a civil war. Do you think that we are as polarized? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. I mean, when I show my children what debates were like between Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, or you show them the Bush Kerry debates, they cannot relate in the slightest to that America. They've assumed and they've accepted the reality of Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump, Joe Biden, right? Your views. Do you think that we are trending in a way that we can't sort of right the ship? Are we going to just have more divisions, and this could end up in a really bad place? How do you see that?
So I make myself feel better by noting all the similar times where actually we were pretty divided. It's funny. I've come to the conclusion that the 70-year period essentially between Harry Truman and George W. Bush, and I might, some form of that, it was an outlier. Because if you actually look at, that the Cold War was this, that the Cold War kept both parties from going too far to their fringes, right? It was during the Cold War that you had the left pushing away the communists and the socialists, and the right pushing away the Birchers and the fascists, right? And they really did. They sort of policed it. And the two parties, I mean, the reason those debates between Clinton and Dole, right, and even between Bush and Gore, they rarely disagreed on national security, right? All of the disagreements were on taxes, right? Funding, it was sort of, there was no disagreement about who we were as a country. Right. There was no, and it's because we were in this existential cry. We were the beacon of democracy at a time. We were in a Cold War against an alternative ideology.
Mhm.
And then that ends. And it's not lost on me that the Berlin Wall falls in 89. Pat Buchanan challenges H.W. Bush from the right the next presidential election in 92, which arguably was truly sort of the first shot of the Trump wars, right? You know, because Buchanan was doing Trump before Trump knew what Trump was,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so, and if you look at America pre-World War II, right? The Republican Party of today looks a lot like the Republican Party of the 20s and 30s, right? Very nationalist, a bit xenophobic, you know, bit isolationist. Our media was super partisan in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Our media is super partisan right now. So the reason I sit there and say there's some parallels, right? And you know, I go, boy, is this the 1850s or the 1960s, right? In the 1960s, we sort of resolved things and we moved on. In the 1850s, we actually had to have we had to have violence,
Right.
and I, you know, so you know, it is. If we get the wrong leadership, we can end up in the wrong direction. There's no doubt. I think we're fraught. But I will say this, you know, the voters usually figure it out. And if you look at our voting patterns since 2012, we haven't voted for a thing. We have not successfully had an affirmative election. They've all been who I don't want elections, right? It was a vote against Hillary in 16. It was a vote against Trump in 20. It was clearly a vote against Biden and Harris in 24. And so, you know, I think the voters know they don't like what they see. You know, and so they keep just letting us know what they don't want. They're not quite clear on what they want yet because the right leaders perhaps haven't met the moment. So, you know, I think before we fall into a full-on civil war with each other, I think we're going to see third parties pop up here or there. That's what happened you know, you had Teddy Roosevelt, you know, you had a whole bunch of third parties popped up. There was this party called the Republican Party that showed up in the 1850s.
Yeah.
You had Ross, you know, Ross Perot, I think sobered up both parties in 92, helped them, you know, I think helped them both become better political parties in the 90s because of his candidacy. So I do think that the voters are going to continue to force a reckoning here in one form or another before we sort of give up on the process. I mean, I will say this, I you know, there's a part of me that looks at the 24 election and says, you know, voters acted pretty rationally. They said they didn't like this economy. And so they said, you know, and you know, the Democrats they haven't produced a nominee that wasn't essentially dictated to them by the party bosses since 2008. That's a problem.
Yeah.
I think there's also a problem with the dynamic where a lot of the political discourse is still stuck in the 20th century. You know, everything's about either breaking
Because
up
the
big
boomers
companies
won't go away, Luis. The boomers have, you know, my God, think about this. I think the most amazing, like, historical fact that we live in right now is that George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump were born like 70 days apart in 1946, right? Between June and August.
It's pretty
And
crazy.
one of those guys was elected president in 1992, and the other guy is going to finish his presidency in 2028. I mean, my God. And you're wondering why all of our debates are stuck in the 20th century? We have a bunch of 20th century leaders. We've only had one 21st century leader.
Yep.
And it was Obama, right? Yeah. I mean, Biden was a 20th century product of a 20th century, you know, they're all stuck there. So I definitely think, you know, and it's like part of the small Gen X, you know, screw you boomers. I was watching this thing about Social Security. We're going to be the first generation to get screwed on Social Security because our generation isn't big enough to be a constituency group that the politicians care about.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing to me that's interesting is that it's not just that Democrats and Republicans aren't really talking about new things, but that the voters have evolved in a different way. So I think after 2012, it wasn't just um, I think it's not that they were voting left, right, or class warfare. I think it's new versus old, and there's something missing there where a lot of our polling and issue analysis in national politics is stuck with that rearview mirror. So yeah, if you ask somebody, of these of these 20 issues, which ones do you rank as most important? You're going to get answers. But what if you actually look at what they're voting on, the new versus old, and that doesn't mean young versus old in age, but new ideas and new things are going to resonate in many ways more with people, which is, I think, where Trump took advantage of going after minority voters, despite being, as I like to say, the most racist candidate since maybe Strom Thurmond, right?
But the authenticity, I won't back away from this. We were talking about the ability of candidates to have long form discussion, Chuck.
That's right.
They don't do
You
it.
get to know who they are. You get to know
they
how
don't
they
do
think.
it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we're getting into the substance, and I think that substance is really important, but it's also important to be inspiring and to be authentic. And Donald Trump, for whatever his other problems are, and we can name lots of problems there, speaks to somebody. He does speak to a group of people, and he makes them feel a certain way. I think our friend Mamdani, we go back to New York, maybe we might not agree with him on the policies, but he's really getting people to pay attention, and he's being really exciting, right?
Well, he's also doing something else that Democrats do a terrible job of normally, which is he's agreeing with the voters. Donald Trump's gift is simply, what are the voters complaining about? Okay, then I'll complain about it, right? It's always been Democrats, Republicans are always much better at saying, hey, are you upset? What are you upset about? Oh, you're upset about water rights in Iowa? Well, fine. We're going to be upset about water rights too. The Democrats say, what are you upset about? Water rights in Iowa? Well, let us tell you about climate change. Right.
Yeah.
It's like we want, and it is, come agree with us. Right. While the Republicans are saying, we'll agree with you. Right. Which is, look, it could be. And yes, I know how silly that sounds and all that stuff, but it is about connecting with the voter, and Republicans connect that way better than Democrats do.
Their
Chuck,
assumption is we know better. That's the problem with Democrats.
We
know better.
And in the last couple of minutes, because we do have just a couple minutes left with you, so I want to, along those lines, because of this new old divide where Mamdani's showing that something new, even if it's a little bit out there, further to the left, is resonating by virtue of even just being new. How are Democrats looking in the horse race for 2026, and what should we be keeping an eye out for, particularly when they're moving towards the old in, say, Ohio, where now Sherrod Brown's going to run again, and yet he might be their best candidate. So that kind of bucks that idea of new versus old.
Yeah, I look at the Sherrod Brown candidacy and think I look, it's the best they can get. But I don't know why he wants to do it. Do you know if he wins, he has to turn around and run again in 2 years?
Yeah.
It's technically a special, it fills the term of Vance. I don't get that one. It's a bit head scratcher on that. But then again, who else were they going to get, right? On that front. So I kind of get it, but you're onto something. Look, 26, Trump's unpopular. I think it all depends on how bad do you think this economy is going to look in the spring of 26, not in the fall, right? Because we know that it's more the impression that voters have of the economy in the fall is dictated by how it feels in the spring. I'm pretty pessimistic. I'm pretty worried as somebody who's, paying for 2 kids in college, right? I am, I'm looking at it in my own, like, I think there's going to be both a pullback in the stock market and a pullback in the real economy with what these tariff hits are going to be. And I think if that happens, boy, the Democrats can run doormats and win elections, right? It's not gonna matter. But if this is if he's able to sort of turn on and off the tariffs just enough to keep stagflation from totally taking hold by the spring of 26, like it feels like our economy is like a hot air balloon with a whole bunch of holes in it, and every once in a while stuff's being pumped into it to just keep the balloon afloat. Right now, what's keeping our economy afloat is really all this AI investment, right? It's masking sort of all sorts of other issues, at least as far as investors are concerned in that. And so, and the tariff, they really haven't hit yet, right? Because with China, he keeps turning them on and off. But you're starting to see, prices are only going up, right? There's nothing where it's going down. So ultimately, I do think the state of the economy matters more than anything. But, I look at this and the Republicans are not as divided as they were in 18 and 22 in primaries, and it's
Yeah.
the Democrats that are going to have divisive primaries. I think that if the last 4 cycles and midterms have been about how Republicans have blown opportunities because of bad nominees, the party that's more likely to have the bad nominee that blows a race that they should win this time is probably going to be the Democrats, because there's going to be a lot more primary fights. But you know what? That's a good thing. I think the party needs a big fight. I think they've been trying to paper things over. I think the party, who should be taking the lead here, right? I mean, there's no leadership, and that's okay. Have a big fight. Bill Clinton and Jesse Jackson had a huge fight in 89 and 90.
I
It
think New
ended
York
up
has
being
energized
really healthy.
Democrats. So
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think New York is an example of that. Even Cuomo.
But
is looking
Mamdani has to
suddenly energized.
successfully govern. Like, if Mamdani is a governing disaster, you'll watch the Democratic Party race to the center.
Yeah.
By the way, the bar is very low on that, because we have Mayor Nightlife now who doesn't do anything.
So true. Actually, and no, it's true. There really hasn't been a stable mayor since Bloomberg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess de Blasio wasn't in hindsight, it's sort of like the George W. Bush presidency. It's aging better than I thought it would, right? Because of Trump. And it's like de Blasio's term as mayor is aging better just because of Eric Adams. But
yeah, that's pretty funny.
That fight that Chuck is alluding to, it has to take place now. So, you'll have a shot at having an alternative for the presidential. It can't take on a fight without, a time span, because we're losing other things that are important for the Republic.
Okay, just so you know, though, the Republican Party had this massive fight in 15 and 16 that a bunch of us probably believed was going to be disastrous for the party.
Yeah.
Turns out it was really healthy for them.
Yeah. Chuck, I know we're at time, so I appreciate you. I wish we could have had more. We could talk for hours, because there's the Trump-Putin summit that I'm sure you have tons of great perspective on. I'm not sure we'll see anything much different than what we saw in Helsinki, but
boy, I sure hope it's a little different than Helsinki. I hope he's grown a tiny spine.
The bar is low. Yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Great to talk with you guys. Let's do it again. All right.
Thank you.
You got it, guys. Bye.
Yeah.
He is so good, and he you know what? I think one of the things, what was great about Meet the Press was he talked to America, not to Washington. Because this was a chance. Meet the Press was formed for politicians to sit down with journalists, but it got very inside the Beltway. And I think what Tim and what Chuck really did was open it up to the country, so someone in California, New York could watch it and understand the issues of today and where both sides are, and it doesn't get too wonky.
Yeah, Chuck was actually the first interview I did when I left the White House in 2013. Was on his show on MSNBC, and I remember after we wrapped the segment, I'm getting up out of the table, and he reaches out his arm. He's like, "Welcome to the world of punditry." And it was a cool moment. It's like, oh, look, Chuck Todd is welcoming me to the world of punditry. Look at that.
He was
Nice.
right. Yeah, he was right. Yep.
But Louis, you brought up the summit with Trump and Putin, and I just have to say this: I wish we would stop treating Russia like an equal. Russia is a third world country. It is. They can't beat you. Ukraine is like 1/8 of the size, and they can't beat them. Like, the entire economy is based on oil. If it's $70 or over, they have money. If it's not, I mean, it's a rural. It's uneducated. It's a third world country. And anytime I see Putin sharing a stage with an American president, I want to scream. They should not have that stature.
Well, and I don't know if it's his some sort of degenerative issue or what, but even Trump from the White House press briefing room twice said that he was going to Russia to meet with Putin. He's going to
Sarah
Alaska.
Palin can show it at her house.
He's going exactly. Sarah Palin can show his house from where he can see Russia, and he's actually going to Alaska. And 2018, it really did set a low bar. I think it was just a complete capitulation. Trump looked scared almost when he came out. There's also that very strange one-on-one meeting where no American went in with Trump, which was very odd. And I believe the translator was a Russian, if anything. And I hope we don't see that. And he has to his credit, we say we're centered. I'm going to be balanced here. To his credit, he has been more critical of Putin in recent weeks and recent days because of his frustration that they keep bombing Kiev and other parts of Ukraine while he's supposedly, talking to him about a ceasefire. So admittedly, he has been a little bit more critical. But look, I think the Europeans are terrified. And the fact that he's going into this talking about land swaps at the front, we've got to remind folks that this issue, just the same way that we talk about with DC, right? Like the issue with DC policing is not the crime in DC, because there's certainly crime. There's certainly issues that need to be addressed. The issue is that it's being used as an excuse to normalize excesses of federal interference, policing of minority communities. This is going to be very much about white and non-white in the way that Trump is trying to roll it out. And you see it in the way that they talk about it. And then in the Russia situation, we have to keep in mind that it's not about just Ukraine, because if there is a land swap that is extremely favorable to Russia, there is nothing saying that they won't try to do the same with other countries. You think about the Baltics with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. What's to stop that now if they're like, okay, well, we take some territory and then we force a land swap just like we did in Ukraine. So it's not just about Ukraine. I think Europeans understand this very well. Hopefully they were able to convince Donald Trump of that on the call that they had with him this week with Zelensky and European leaders. But this could be a very pivotal meeting and scary because of what it could portend.
There's a couple of things. One is Alaska hasn't been Russian since 1867. So for him to keep on saying that he's going to Russia, he's revisionist. The other issue is
he might have that erased from the Smithsonian, like he wants to have slavery and everything else erased from it.
All those things. There's a couple of different things happening here. I mean, I'm getting reports that there's going to be a meeting, a one-on-one between the two presidents, again, without, staff. This is just going to be with the translators, which is reminiscent of the meeting that occurred years ago. That's of concern, and that's worrisome. There's some issues that you equated, Lise, that I think are important here. The precedent on the DC side and the precedent of the Russia side, which is, they're alluding to a land swap. Zelensky can't, but in his constitution, he cannot do that. Trump alluded to that in a press conference, saying, why couldn't he? But these are some of the things that are starting to happen. This summit is less about resolving the war in Ukraine and more about testing each other's positions. And the White House is now setting these really low expectations, calling it a listening session, but the optics are pretty clear. This is, Putin's coming to U.S. soil without Zelensky or European allies.
If he's going into these meetings with only an interpreter and he doesn't have the State Department people there and intelligent people who know the land, who know the terrain, who know the politics, like Trump doesn't know any of this. And he's going to go in there and he's going to make the worst deal. The guy has filed for bankruptcy 7 times. He's not the deal maker. And it just, every time Putin just steals our lunch and leaves us embarrassed. So I have no hopes for this. And I think Trump is going to sell out Ukraine. He has no affinity for Ukraine. It's what got him impeached. So, and the fact that Ukraine's not even part of this is kind of laughable. They're negotiating.
This is not a summit, Jeremy. This is a distraction.
Yeah.
That's what this is. And you put this together with what's happening in DC, you put it together with, these outlandish statements that are being made for a series of different things. And all it is, moving the attention of the American populace to something else and new. The Epstein thing is where he pulls the worst. Americans still want clarity when it comes to that, and they're not getting any of it. And I don't think they're going to get it.
Look, you federalize the police in DC, and suddenly you have Morning Joe and Semaphore arguing about Democrats being divided. and instead of talking about Republicans pressuring him over the Epstein files.
It's working.
It's working.
Yeah.
It's not only about testing the limits of what you can turn normal, it's also about how much you can throw out there to distract from everything you don't want to focus on.
My prediction is Ghislaine Maxwell is going to get a pardon in exchange for saying Donald Trump had nothing to do with Epstein. That's my prediction.
Yeah, they were teasing that they were going to release parts of the tapes of her meeting with his personal attorney recently. We'll see. We'll see what comes of that.
Then the question becomes sort of what's the opposition doing? What the opposition can do? How can they be creative about getting ahead and making sure that folks are still aware of these issues? It's very difficult, and we've had this conversation here. It's very difficult to sort of lead the discussion sort of thread, the daily discussion thread, in the position that they're in. Being in the minority in Congress, right? Not having the White House, but there has to be something crafty with the use of social media. There has to be something to keep the discussion, or to break sort of the lock on these redirectional ploys that are employed by the White House. I still think that needs to be done. Yeah.
I also think Democrats are still haunted by Michelle Obama. When they go low, we go high. Grow up. Do you want to be pure and lose? I mean, it's time to grow up. Like, bring a bazooka to a knife fight. We have to get out of that. They will always go low. We need to go low, just as low, or we're never going to win.
Chuck disagreed with us on that.
All right. Reasonable people can disagree.
His answer was just go campaign. And I think we're in a different moment. This is not just this is not the political reality of 15 years ago. The losses now mean real, I guess, cementing of executive power.
Well, then let me just, for closing, if it's Friday, it's centered. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Carl. Thanks to our listeners. Go ahead and subscribe. Again, this is a listener-supported platform, so your subscriptions and your support mean a heck of a lot. And we hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. And this is what we're going to work to do: is bring more guests like this to continue to just elevate the discussion and really bring out different viewpoints. I thought that the part of the discussion where we were really talking about how these topics get such little coverage, you can't dig in on a 5 or 10 minute segment on cable in the way that we just did over the last hour with Chuck Todd. Those conversations are necessary. I'm really happy we got the chance to do that.
Yeah, I think it was good because we weren't bound by certain things. We let the conversation just flow, and it went into some really interesting areas.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And for our listeners, don't forget to subscribe, hit that subscribe button, share, and thank you for your support. See you next week. Our panel featured Louis Miranda, former Obama White House communications advisor and former spokesperson at DHS, Carl Meacham, former Clinton appointee and a former senior Republican staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Jeremy Murphy, former CBS executive, author, and publicist.